Listen up, this is a very important video. I'm going to talk to you about how dangerous hot rodding can be and give you 10 tips that could actually save your life. I'm going to share a story with you of what happened to me in a car just like this. 69 Camaro, throttle linkage got stuck when I was on my first drive. Car got trailered to me. I've never driven it, never looked under the hood. I'm out on a first test drive and the throttle stuck. It had 500 horsepower. It just started pulling. So of course I hit the throttle real quick to try to get it to come loose. It got stuck wide open. Tried to turn the car off. It's a 69, so I had to keep being able to steer, so I turned it to accessory. It kept running because the ignition was wired wrong. Here I am, full throttle, smashing down the road. Tried to throw it in reverse, neutral, something, blow up the transmission. Ratchet shifter, I couldn't get it to go quick enough. Time's going by. So finally, I had no other option. There's a tree, there's a house, and I could turn down the street where the neighboring street is, and there's a bunch of kids. I chose to crash it smack dab right into the middle of the tree. It was the only way I could stop the car. It's crazy. The throttle linkage got stuck, pinned the throttle wide open, boom. I wound up in the hospital, car totally mangled. Don't let this happen to you. Let's talk a little bit about some of these throttle linkages and how you can avoid that. On any old school carbureted car, it's so important that you have a good throttle return spring. When you click this carb open and you're driving down the road, you want to make sure that thing's always going to pin back and close the throttle. In the instance I was talking about, the throttle pegged all the way open and the linkage arm had clicked over and bound it up. So it's very important that you have a throttle return spring, nice straight cables whenever you're having a throttle cable design, or if you've got throttle rods. You want to make sure there are no kinks or bends. This one's actually even a little tight in my opinion, but as long as the pedal operates smoothly, you want to make sure that nothing can get bound up in the linkage. So this is a 65 Mustang here that has a mechanical throttle linkage. When you have a mechanical throttle linkage, you want to make sure that you've got all of your linkage in a nice straight line, no crazy angles. Throttle return spring, you can see this guy's got multiple throttle return springs, so hit the gas, bam, it closes up. You want to make sure it's nice and straight, nice and tight, not too tight that it binds up, but you want to make sure there's not a lot of slop in it. Additionally, you want to make sure if your air cleaner's on there that you don't get any bind. This has a drop base on it, and a lot of times what you'll see is when that's on there, it'll come down and hit the throttle linkage. So right now, I'll give it a rev. We're nice and clear. So a bad example is on this 68 Camaro here. Look at this throttle linkage. See how that can pull in? It's so loose. It's got some washer just sitting on here. It's all bound up in the spark plug wires. So easily, I could probably floor it. If this wire stuck like that or something, it could pin the throttle open, right? We're stuck right there. See, I'm not closed. This thing could get in there, rev it up, get jammed. That's not good. Make sure you have nice straight throttle linkages. Any cables you have are not frayed or kinked, and make sure you have throttle return springs. It's super important. So in that example of that crash, I was talking about shifters. Anytime you have a shifter, floor shifter, column shifter, it's nice if you can have a reverse lockout. First, second, I can't go into reverse without pushing the button on this 69 Charger. Keeps me from throwing it in reverse. I'll show you another car where you can put it straight into reverse, and I'll explain to you what happens in that case. So on that Charger, it had a reverse lockout, right? On this Pontiac column shift, I've got no reverse lockout. I can go straight into reverse. So if I'm out goofing around first, second, go to hit third, hit reverse. If I've got a good transmission, this thing can go into reverse. Car's gonna pitch sideways. In fact, when I was in my 20s, my brother-in-law had a really nice K10 truck, lifted, built to the hilt motor, and I remember we were out in the country, cord of wood in the back of the truck, and a couple dudes sitting in the front seat, and he decides to hot rod it. So he does. He hits first, hits second, and it skirts him. Hits third instead of third, he hit it into reverse. That Turbo 400 took it. It actually paused it up in reverse while we were going about 50 miles an hour, started sliding out, rolled the truck, flipped the truck over on its side, cord of wood, everywhere all over the highway. My buddy busted his knee. Everybody else was fine. A few stitches later, we were good. Make sure it doesn't happen to you. These things are so basic, but so important. I know it sounds redundant. I just showed you on another car, but again, make sure that thing has some kind of a reverse safety. It even happened to my wife. She had a 68 Camaro and she was out horsing around and thought she was gonna have a little fun and went first, second, reverse. Paused it up, car starts going sideways. She was fine, the car was fine, she was lucky, car was lucky. So if you can, always make sure you have some kind of reverse lockout. This is a fancy race shifter from Hurst. Not my favorite in a lot of cars, but when you do a shifter, if it's a B&M, a Hurst, a stock, just try to make sure you have some kind of a lockout like this does that keeps you from going into reverse or park accidentally. Another hugely important thing is headlights. So often these old cars have very dim headlights. They don't work all that great. This Mustang has a stock set of headlights. They work okay, but if you get out on the road at night in the rain or anything, you're just not going to see very well. So I recommend you upgrade your headlights anytime you can. This Camaro has a bright LED combination, halogen bulb, super duper bright. It's going to help you see everything going down the road, save you from hitting an animal, pothole in the road, whatever you might come across. It's just one of the easiest things you can do to increase safety and visibility with your classic car. Instead of running an old crappy headlight, upgrade to at least, this is a halogen, at least upgrade to a halogen bulb. It's going to cost you like 20 bucks as opposed to 10 bucks for a cheap one. Or you can upgrade, this is a Holley retro bright light. Looks very much like an original light, but it's got a bulb inside. It's an H4 xenon type, super duper bright. Make sure you upgrade those headlights. So I'm sure every single one of you is an amazing driver, but a lot of people that are out on the road with you aren't good drivers. So for safety, anytime you're in one of these classic cars, always wear your seatbelt. I recommend a 3-point seatbelt. Holds you in nice and tight. At least have a lap belt or something to hold you in the car. A lot of the early cars, like 30s, 40s, even 50s, didn't have seatbelts at all. So in that case, at least have a lap belt. But if you can, I always recommend putting a 3-point seatbelt in them. They make them for trucks, all the Chevelles, Mustangs, Camaros, Corvettes. There's a lot of aftermarket kits out there that can give you a nice 3-point seatbelt combo. One really important thing that people don't really always realize is to make sure your holes where your seatbelt goes in aren't stripped out. I see so often where the bolt doesn't thread in properly and doesn't engage all the way. So you want to make sure that that bolt goes through the seatbelt and goes in all the way and locks down tight. A lot of times when you add a seatbelt to a car, you'll drill a hole in a car that didn't have a seatbelt, or you put additional seatbelts in, you'll drill a hole and guys will put like a washer behind it and then a nut. What I recommend you do is you get something like this. They make these reinforcing plates that you can put through the floor, so that way when you put your seatbelt through the floor, it's locking in positively and sandwiching against the floor. It's going to hold the seatbelt in tight so it doesn't rip out upon impact. The last thing you want to do is have a seatbelt that's barely held in and then you crash and it doesn't do its job. They're there to save your life. Like I was talking about on the floors, make sure if you ever add a 3-point seatbelt or anything else to your car, you reinforce where it mounts. On this convertible, we've got the quarter panel comes together, the door jamb and everything here. And so we've got our seatbelt with a plate back here welded in place, so there's no way that seatbelt's gonna go anywhere. Again, make sure it's able to do its job. The next most important thing you can do to your car is make sure you have great brakes. I'm a big fan of disc brakes, especially up front. I don't really like drum brakes. This is a drum brake set that's coming off of our Falcon here. So we're doing a 5-lug upgrade because we went to a V8 and we're gonna go disc brakes. This is a kit by Willwood. What I don't like about drum brakes, and some of you guys are purists, if you wanna keep your car all original, that's fine. But with drum brakes, it's so important that they're balanced properly. If you get the shoes adjusted just right, you're going down the road, the front wheels stop straight. If they're out of adjustment at all, worn unevenly, a lot of times you get a car that's gonna pull to one side. Especially in the rain, you hit the brakes and one of those wheels oftentimes will have a tendency to lock up before all of the others. So I love a set of disc brakes on the front of my car. You can do them on the back if you want. They're great. They don't do as much good as you might think they do, but go for it if you like it. But make sure you have your brakes adjusted properly. Make sure if you have disc brakes in the rear or really any setup, you're running a prop valve that's adjustable, combination valve, so you get the right bias. You want to make sure your system's bled. All brake hoses are in great condition. The system's working properly and the car will stop way better. It might save your life. Speaking of brakes, an e-brake is super important. Most people use it as a parking brake and that's really what it's designed for, but that parking brake is also an e-brake. If your brakes go out on you, you got no brake pedal, you can hit that e-brake pedal. Pull the e-brake handle, step on the e-brake pedal, that'll engage your rear brakes and you can actually stop. Slow down at best, ideally stop the car That's why you want to have an emergency brake. Make sure not just your brake system's working right, but your e-brake system is all dialed in and adjusted properly. In one of my previous videos, I talked about not needing rear disc brakes. If you want them, fine. They actually do serve a great purpose. They look cool and they can stop phenomenally well when done right. The part that I was getting at in that video was so often I see brakes that don't have a good parking brake. So like this kit here is a Willwood kit, and you can see it's got a nice brake cable design, so it'll pull the parking brake lever and engage the brakes. Instead of relying on the brake caliper here, inside this setup it's actually got a brake drum kit that's inside the brake rotor that's pressing shoes against the inner drum to engage the e-brake. That's the way I like to see it, instead of something that's kind of leaning on a ratcheting mechanism to click the calipers. Rear disc brakes are great if done right. So many people with classic cars don't have functional windshield wipers, and I get it, you're probably not going to drive the car in the rain, but if you're like me and a lot of other people, you like to drive your car a lot. So make sure you have wipers that work well. You definitely want to make sure that they're covering the whole windshield. This is a good example of a car that has a good set of blades on it, so when they go, they're going to wipe the windshield well. And also on a lot of these cars, I'll add an updated wiper system. So this has a multi-speed wiper motor kit in it. So you notice they're on intermittent right now. You can set them at different speeds. They can really get flying when they're on full speed, and you can set them low like you would any other car. This particular kit has a Detroit Speed setup on the Camaro. It's a 7-speed kit. If you don't have functional wipers or you have weak wipers, again, these blades are only so big and only cover so much of the windshield. Rain-X is your friend. Take some of the Rain-X water repellent, treat your windshield with it, rub it in. It'll totally help repel the water off your windshield and keep that visibility clear for you. Inside visibility through that windshield is also important, so put some of that Rain-X on the inside of the glass. It's really going to help with some of that misting and fogging you get on there. And for me, I always try to make sure I have a good defrost system. Make sure you've got a fan that blows strong. Ideally, it's coming out in a nice defrost pattern. Between the wipers and the defrost, you have that windshield clear, you have visibility, and you'll be safe to roll. A lot of these safety issues may seem really basic, possibly redundant to you, but it's the little things that a lot of people don't notice, and I want to make sure that you guys are paying attention to those things. On this GTX, what is going on here? Is it normal to have that much play in the steering? I would argue not. So if you look in here, you can see I've got a wasted steering coupler. It shouldn't have all that play in it. Come over here and I'll show you a couple things and explain a little bit about steering columns and steering rag joints. So what happens in something like this Mopar is you've got a steering coupler here, and the steering coupler is very loose. When it's too loose, it's going to cause slack in your steering, right? So it's going to make your steering less responsive, less accurate. Most importantly, if it was to come further loose and snap off, you're going to have absolutely no steering. So you always want to make sure you have good steering components. Obviously, steering linkages are important, tie rod ends, ball joints, steering box. But what so many people forget is things like this, just a little rag joint. This is a $20 part, and it's what couples your steering to the column to the box. This little guy right here is just made out of leather and plastic, vinyl, whatever the heck they make it with anymore. And the original ones had like a steel liner in it. But what happens is these wear out and then they start to rip. If this rips, you're going to lose your steering. What happens then? No bueno. Also, if you've got an aftermarket steering linkages, a lot of people will be running a combination of like double D shafts and such. Always make sure that you take time and make sure that all of these little set bolts, these Allens and these nuts are tight. You want to make sure that every steering component you have is tight. If these come loose and back out, that could slide out, and again, your steering wheel is doing nothing. So pay special attention to steering columns, rag joints, and steering couplers. Make sure your suspension and your steering, which is your control of the vehicle, is on point. I'm going to use this Falcon here for another example. Suspension. All these cars are probably 40, 50, 60 years old. I don't know how old your car is, but all of the suspension gets worn out, clapped out, completely worn and wasted. So anytime you can, make sure that you've got healthy, fresh steering components. I'm going to put a bigger sway bar on. You can see the difference in size between the stock sway bar and this aftermarket sway bar. That's really gonna level my steering. When I hit a pothole on this side, it's gonna help absorb the impact so it doesn't go all the way to the other side. Good control arms, good bushings. On this car, we're taking out these hideous lower arms here. That'll be next, but we've changed the spindle, the upper control arm, and put a nice set of coilover shocks on here. You don't have to go with coilovers. You don't have to go fancy. Just make sure that you have good shocks, good bushings, good steering components like we talked about a minute ago. Upgrade the sway bar, anything you can do to give you better control of your car. There are so many different suspension upgrades you can do to these cars these days. I'm going to do another video series where I talk about a lot of the upgrades you can do in the future, so stay tuned and see what else we come out with next. This is just a good example on this 67 Nova of a bunch of new front suspension. It's got rack and pinion, tubular control arms, a whole custom front clip. Sway bars are so important in my opinion. Braking upgrades we talked about, making sure all your linkages are tight. All of these things combine to give you the best driving experience and the ultimate in safety. The last thing I'm going to talk to you about today are tires, lug nuts, and mounting them on the car properly. So many people take for granted that their tires are good. This tire has plenty of tread left. Other than the fact that it's cupped and on some old rim, it's got a lot of tread. But if you zoom in closer, you can see all the cracking on that tire. That tire, if you go hit the open road, especially get on the highway, is probably going to vibrate, and moreover, it could explode. Get a flat tire on the front, lose control, that's unsafe. So what I would do is I'd recommend you check out the date code on the tire. You can see how old your tires are. Additionally, so many of these cars came with like bias ply tires. I'd recommend you go with some kind of a TA, some kind of an all-terrain type tire that's made for today's roads. So this is a BF Goodrich, probably one of the best tires you see, very common on muscle cars, whether you've got rallies, stock wheels, or some kind of aftermarket mag like this. But BFGs are phenomenal. Doesn't really matter what brand. Just make sure you get a good tread pattern that's going to disperse water in the rain. Make sure that your tires, although they look new, are actually new, because date coding is important. Tires do have a shelf life. Last but not least, lug nuts. This is a perfect example. This Chevelle is just sitting here in the shop, hasn't been driven. It's only got 2 lug nuts on it. Obviously that's not okay. I see a lot of people rolling around with broken studs, missing studs. So make sure you have all your lug nuts on there. 5 is what it calls for. 5 is what it should have. In a pinch, maybe you do 4 to get home, but you should have all 5 on there. Make sure your studs are in good condition. Your nuts will thread down on there smoothly. And it's very important that the stud is engaged properly by the lug nut. It's hard to see on this one, but somebody put disc brakes on here, and with this wheel, I barely have any stud on there. So if I've got my lug nuts tight, I don't know how long they're gonna hold this wheel on. So make sure your studs are long enough to accommodate whatever wheels you have. If you've got Kragers or something like these, you'll see that these wheels have to have a special mag shank lug nut. So just make sure you have the right lug nuts for your wheels. Back in the day when I was in college, my wife picked up a really nice 68 Camaro. I was so jealous. It had Allied wheels or maybe Kragers or something, and so when she bought it, the car was phenomenal. Problem was, it had the wrong lug nuts on it. She called me one day driving it on the freeway and said the car was shaking super bad. I'm like, that car's solid, man. Pull over and check it out, make sure all the lug nuts are on there. She pulled over, looked, all the lug nuts were there. So she gets in the car and starts to drive away, and here's a giant clunk. A couple of the lug nuts straight snapped off and the tire kicked sideways. So make sure you have the proper lug nuts, you have all quality, quantity, proper style, proper torque. Wheels, tires, lug nuts are very important. Thanks for tuning in and learning a lot of the tips that I know and some of the struggles I've seen with these classic cars. Remember, safety first. It's dangerous out there, so happy motoring.